What's up everybody, Impossible here. Welcome to my second video about map design. Today we're going to be looking at symmetry and flow. Now I want to stress before this video starts that you may already have a map design in mind, and that's good. This is not going to be like one of those videos where like you talk about a few different things and it'll be like, only use this one, the rest of them are terrible. No, we're going to go over many different things, and the objective of this is that the map that you have in mind, you'll be able to tell what kind of flow your map will have, and then keep the things in mind that I'll tell you about different types of flows, and you can design your map accordingly. I'm not going to be like, oh, it has to be 3-lane map, or it has to be like whatever, right? You know, whatever map you're planning, it's already going to be a certain way, but there's just some things you want to keep in mind for different types of maps. Alright, so starting out here, first we're going to cover some symmetry. So there's three types of symmetry, essentially. You have symmetrical maps that are either rotationally or reflectively symmetric. If you don't know what that means, don't even worry about it. If you know what symmetric means, that's good enough. So symmetric maps, they have more predictable movement and balance, which is maybe not obvious, but it should be pretty easy to understand why that would be. Especially balance, because each side of the map is basically the same. I mean, you can't really get something easier to balance than that. And then also because each side of the map is the same, both teams will have similar movement patterns and will tend to encounter each other in the same places and about the same frequencies. They're also easier to make if you can just make one half of the map, copy it all, flip it around, and just paste it, maybe change one or two things. Of course, it's just easier to make that way. And it's also easier to plan because it's symmetrical. So the main advantage of symmetrical maps is that they're easier to make, easier to balance, easier to predict how people are going to move. You know, but the disadvantage is that they're not there's only so much variety you can have. It's hard to make a really unique symmetrical map. Is it hard to make a unique symmetrical map? No. Basically every symmetrical map that's made is unique to other ones, but it's hard to make one that's really unique and distinctive compared to the others. That's just kind of how it is when things are symmetrical. Now, the opposite of that, an asymmetrical map, for example here on Modern Warfare 3 Arcadon, advantage is they look cooler, they tend to be more interesting, far easier for them to feel unique because there's a much greater variety of how you can do them. But the main disadvantage is that asymmetrical maps are harder to balance. Now, if you have dynamic spawns, meaning the spawn points are kind of scattered around the map and will change depending on where the enemies are, then balance is not necessarily so much of an issue. If you have static spawns, for example in Skillwarz, you can just place the spawns down, and that's where people will spawn. You don't really want to have spawns scattered all over the map because people will spawn randomly all over the map. If you have static spawns where the enemy knows where the other team will spawn, then it's a lot harder to balance an asymmetrical map because one team will tend to have the advantage. They'll either have a better route, they'll have better cover, better this, better that, something like that. It's not impossible to balance these out, and it's not even all that hard to do, but it is harder. And you really have to be aware of how things will play out, how people will use different spots, and it can be hard to predict that in advance. So especially for asymmetrical maps, you may want to make the map the best you can, see how it plays, and go back and change some things to perfect the balance. But there's one last type of map, quasi-symmetrical maps. Quasi just means like almost or approximately or whatever. Quasi-symmetrical maps have a symmetrical balance but an asymmetrical look. Now, for this example, I'm using Gustav Cannon from COD World War II. Now you can see that this map is, well, I mean, it's pretty symmetrical, but it's not completely symmetrical. You can see, for example, on the corners here, we got a building here, those are 2 stories. Over here we just have 1-story things. For all 4 corners, there's kind of like a route around the back here people can use. Similar things going on here and here, but it's not the same. You know, this cannon here, you can get up one side or the other. Again, not the same. This building here and this building here, similar, but not the same. And we're going to go over many of the example maps I'm going to show later are quasi-symmetrical. The quasi-symmetrical maps have the advantage of being easier to balance and predict where people will go. They have a similar flow to symmetrical maps. However, they tend to have the aesthetics closer to asymmetrical maps. So, once again, like I said in the intro, if you're planning on your map to be symmetrical, or let me back up. Like I said in the intro, I'm not going to just tell you how to make your map. If you're planning your map to basically be symmetrical, you may want to consider making it quasi-symmetrical instead of having it be almost perfectly symmetrical. If your map's asymmetrical, can't make it quasi-symmetrical, so you're going to have to work with it being asymmetrical. But these are all just things to keep in mind, once again, depending on how you want your map to be. These are just ways it might be and things to keep in mind. And continuing on that, we're going into flow. Flow is how people move around the map. I think we could probably all know that, or guess that would be the definition. It's not really anything else it could mean. Specifically for flow in a map with, in a game with static spawns, for example, Skillwarz. Because people always spawn in the same place, people always flow basically towards the middle of the map, going straight across the map closest to the enemy. This is kind of the thing people will generally do, but they'll sometimes flank or do weird things. But the main thing to keep in mind, if you're just thinking if you just never thought before about how people tend to go around the map, in a game with static spawns, again, like Skillwarz, the number one thing people will do out of their spawn is just go forward. Will just beeline straight towards the enemy spawn. It's only if there's some difficulty or if they're trying to do some weird tactic or something that they'll tend to flank a significant distance around. And the second thing people will do is go for the high points of the map. We'll touch on those things more, I think, in a later video about spawns and power points and whatnot. But those are the two things to keep in mind. This video is focusing more on the layout of the map. So a very common layout for maps is to have a 3-lane map. Now 3-lane maps are usually quasi-symmetrical. This example here, Black Ops 2 Meltdown. Oh, let me go back one side. Black Ops 2 Meltdown. You can go through the middle here, more or less. There's a lane on the side through this weird thing, and there's a lane up top. And the map doesn't have to be straight like this. For example, this map on Black Ops 2 Overflow is a 3-lane map. It kind of has this L shape. All three of the lanes have this L shape where you have this more direct route up top, this kind of open street in the middle that no one really goes in, and then this flanking route down in the bottom. But once again, we can see we have these 3 lanes. The main spawns are on either side of the map, and even if you were to remake this map in a game with static spawns, of course Black Ops 2 has dynamic spawns where people can spawn anywhere basically. If you're even going to remake this with static spawns, you may still be able to put the spawns here, but you just want to be aware that people are going to rush to this part on the top, just because that's the quickest way to get to the enemy spawn. Asymmetrical maps are oftentimes unlaned, and vice versa. This is an example from Modern Warfare 3's Fallen. Now, asymmetrical maps does not mean pure chaotic, pure chaos or whatnot. Sorry, I'm a little tired. You still want to have flow, and you still want to have some sight lines. For example, on this map, these lines indicate some more open areas of the map where there's some sight lines, and they also indicate some of the main routes that people will move through. So even though, as we can see, this map doesn't fit into those 3-lane examples that I gave before, or doesn't fit very well, there still are lanes and whatnot for people to have engagements that aren't surprising, that aren't up very close, you could use longer range weapons on, and just in general, the routes that people might use to move through the map, even though the map is asymmetrical. For static spawns, this map might be a little bit difficult to place them. Something that might work is to just have them in either corner, like here and here, maybe here and here. Having them here and here on the edges would mean most people are going to move through the middle. But you know, it's kind of doable. You don't have to have a 3-lane map, you know, for it to be good, like I said, but there are lanes on this map is the point. If your map is just a bunch of like random containers or just random, it's like a maze or just something like that, probably not the way to go. Also, if your map only has like 1 or 2 ways to get around it, maybe also not the way to go. And I'll show some more examples later. Another pretty uncommon type, but you do see it sometimes, is what I call a wheel and spoke map. Unfortunately, I only have one example of this. I can think of another map, but it's on Black Ops for DS, the Nintendo DS, and you can't just find like mini maps of that online, and I can't remember it well enough to make it, and I can't find any matches on my Nintendo DS to show you, which would be hard to do anyway, so just never mind on that. This is Hard Hat from MW3. Now, if I diagram it like I did this previous map, Modern Warfare 3 Fallen, it ends up looking like this, and you kind of look at this and it's like, you know, it doesn't really look like I'm getting the full picture or something. Possibly a more useful way to diagram this is a wheel and spoke, where you have this, and it doesn't necessarily have to be round, but it usually is round-ish. There's basically this flanking route all along the edge of the map, and then you have routes coming into the middle here. This can be an interesting design. This is one of those designs that's usually better on a free-for-all map versus a map with 2 teams on either side. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really have any good tips. I don't really have any good tips for this type of map, to be honest. I just wanted to show it as an example of a map that can exist. If you have a free-for-all map, kind of the obvious thing is to place the spawns mostly around the edge here, and then people tend to congregate in the middle. So if you want to make a pretty chaotic free-for-all map, this can be one way to do it. And like I said, this is probably not the best way to make a team deathmatch map. You would need to put the spawns not in front of one of these spokes. So maybe like here and here or something like that. I don't know. But, you know, this is a design. Moving on. I got a few more slides left. Black Ops 2 Carrier. This, I forgot to put the caption in. This is a pretty chaotic map. This is an example of what I was saying to kind of not make. As you can see, there's basically just stuff cluttered around everywhere. This map is pretty large, but there's no real sight lines for stuff. If you played on Black Ops 2, you know that like right up here, this is actually a ramp, so you can camp kind of on the edge here and shoot people over here. Kinda, because there's a lot of stuff in the way. Yeah, weirdly enough, most of the sniping is either like from back here up to here, or like from this thing up to here. And the rest of this is just kind of like random space. So a lot of people complain about this map. It's just too chaotic. So one thing I would recommend, because this is about flow, is to not just have random stuff lying around. Of course you can have cover like next to walls or whatever, but don't just have like an open area filled with random stuff, because your map's just not going to have a good flow. It's just not. It's almost impossible to have one, to make a map with good flow. I mean, this is, you know, Black Ops 2, Treyarch. They have it like this. It doesn't play well. If anyone could do it, they could probably do it, and they couldn't do it. So that's my recommendation on that, is to just avoid that. We talked about 3-lane maps a bunch. If you played Call of Duty any, there's no way there is no way that this is the first time you've heard of that. If you've ever played Call of Duty or watched some Call of Duty videos, because people say that all the time, 3-lane maps, not 3-lane maps, whatever. It's like a whole thing. I'm not going to go into that. People say the maps are too predictable because they have 3 lanes, and then when they're any more complex than that, people complain that they're too complex. Anyway, you can have other numbers of lanes and maps. For example, this is MW3's Outpost is a 2-lane map. If you're going to make a 2-lane map, there's something kind of important, and I actually circled it here. Well, I mean, I circled the 2 kind of like choke points. But there's something kind of important. If you think about, you can see this one here is very close quarters. I mean, you can go from this building to this building and get through the choke point very, very quickly. This one is the opposite. It's a long, open sight line that's good for snipers and light machine gun people. there's really not a whole lot of cover here. So if you're going to make a 2-lane map, or any type of map that has 2 choke points, if they're both like this, then you barely even have a 2-lane map, because there's hardly any resistance here. But if you make both your choke points like this, where that's a long sight line with not a lot of cover, then you're really going to have this really standoffish type of map. Now, if that's what you're going for, that's great. It might work. But it's something to be aware of. If for some reason you want to have a 2-lane map, or you want to have 2 choke points in here, you probably want to have one of them be pretty close quarters and pretty reasonable to be able to get through easily, and have the other one be more sniper and light machine gun or long range weapon friendly. Like I said, that's just a tip. If you have both of them like this or both of them like this, I already discussed that. But once again, I'm not going to tell you how to do it, but just something to keep aware of. 4-lane maps. Well, they're like 3-lane maps, but with a 4th lane. So 3-lane maps, it's pretty easy to flank, but it's pretty common to run into people when you're trying to flank, because you have between, let's say, 4 to 6 people on a team is usually how 3-lane maps are designed. There's only 3 lanes, so you're going to have on average at least one person per lane in a certain time. 4-lane maps, not quite as much. You'll tend to have a couple people, a couple busier lanes and a couple lanes that really aren't being used a whole lot. So the advantage of 4-lane maps is it's easier to flank people. The disadvantage is that they tend to be a little wide because of how the space you need to have 4 lanes. And this one, MW3's Baccarat, is just barely a 4-lane map, because this part is kind of open, so these 2 lanes not really distinct, but it's close enough that I think it works for this example. But like I said, if you have a 4-lane map, keep in mind it may be a good idea to kind of open up some of it, so you have part of it 4-lane, part of it 3-lane. Just make sure that it's not ridiculously wide compared to the length, because then people will end up using it as a 2 or 3-lane map, and you won't have people using the outer lanes like you might expect them to. Once again, just something to be aware of. Yeah, this looks a bit crazy. Multi-lane maps. This is Black Ops 2's Turbine. See, the thing is, the main difference between a map like this and a map that I was talking about before, where I was complaining that there's just stuff around everywhere and it's pure chaos, is that this one, the obstacles are not small. They're large enough where you have to kind of route around them. It's not like a container or a box or something. It's like a big old chunk of rock, part of the mountain, whatever, fallen wind turbine, whatever they got in this map. The multi-lane maps are good if you want to have a spacious open map without having spacious open space. So multi-lane maps can feel pretty open. The disadvantage, of course, is not being able to find enemies very well. But continuing, they feel pretty open, but they're easier to use stuff that's not snipers, basically. They're easier to use assault rifles on or whatever, because there's so many lanes that you won't run into people a whole lot, and there's tons of space to roam around, which makes it feel open. But because you have lanes, it's more of an assault rifle playing field. There's not a whole ton of space. I mean, there's obviously tons of spots on this map where you could post up with a sniper, but it's not like if this was completely open and people were just sniping each other from either side. You know what I mean? Putting all these lanes in here can give you a spacious feel without having a sniper map. That's probably the main, or the only thing important with the multi-lane maps. I personally am not a super huge fan of these, and I don't think many people are, especially for 4v4 to 6v6 size games. Yeah, it's they just tend to feel too spacious. It's something that, sometimes that's what people will want to play on, but they tend to not be, they're not necessarily bad, of course. If they were bad, I'd just tell you not to do it. They're not always bad, and it can actually be done pretty well, but it's something that usually people will not be a huge fan of, because it's just, the gameplay is a bit slower, sight lines, even even with this design that kind of boxes them in, tend to be a bit longer than people might be used to using. In a game like Skillwarz, where the sight lines are already kind of long, maybe not such a big deal. Something more like Call of Duty, where the maps tend to be smaller, this can not feel quite as great. But, like I said, the advantages and disadvantages of all of these. The main point, I will reiterate, is I try to avoid, as best I can, just saying this is good, this is bad, do this, don't do this. That's not the point to any of these videos. And if you see me doing that, call me out on it, because I don't want to do that. I want to show you the advantages and disadvantages, and the main thing being what you need to keep in mind if your map looks like one of these maps. And that will help you design it in a way that will help it be a good map. And I hope the information I presented here was clear and useful. If it wasn't, please leave a comment. I try to answer all of my comments. So if you're confused about something, want further info, something like that, leave a comment. Keep in mind I will be doing videos about spawns and power points, which are like the high spots on the maps and stuff like that in the future. So if it's directly about that, maybe just wait a second. But something in this video, please do leave a comment, because I will read it and try to respond the best I can. With that being said, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I'll catch you later.